You are now listening to the Add 10 Gallons Concrete Podcast.
Wait, the answer was add 10 gallons?
Add 10 gallons.
My first thought was we got to put Actigen in it.
Yeah, great.
Truck's on the way. On the way.
Yeah, okay. I've got two observations, neither of which are really educated or well thought out. Which are like most of my observations are.
There aren't a lot of problems on a job site that can't be solved with a sack full of biscuits.
Today's episode of the Add 10 Gallons Concrete Podcast is brought to you by Actigel 208. Actigel 208 is a high-performance additive for the concrete industry that is greatly beneficial to the producer. It enables them to increase the percentage of manufactured sand by up to 100% and completely replace all the natural sand in the mix. In areas where natural sand is scarce, inconsistent, and expensive, this provides a huge benefit to any ready-mix company out there. Benefits of manufactured sand and concrete include consistent air content, improved compaction, and increased density. Now, in the past, the downside of using manufactured sands was that they were hard to pump, hard to place, and hard to finish. Well, Actigel 208 solves all those issues. By improving suspension, stability, and the quality of the cement paste in the mix, Actigel overcomes the old issues with manufactured sand and leaves them behind. Let Actigel 208 improve the quality of your mix while saving money on every yard you produce. For more information, visit us at actigel.com. That's ACTI-GEL.com.
Well, welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to the Add 10 Gallons Concrete Podcast. I'm Josh, and as always, I'm joined by Paul and Joey, like usual, and we apologize for not putting out any content in a while. We've been busy working, spreading the good word of Actigel and on concrete job sites all over this country, but we finally made it back to the studio to bring you guys some content, and today we have a special episode. We've decided to drill down on one of the key topics in the concrete industry, and it has been for a while, and it will continue to be so. So we're going to talk about carbon emissions, and we're going to go in depth with fantastic detail, stats, and plenty of information to back up our claims. So in order to do that, we got Paul and Joey here. Paul, what's going on, man?
What's up, dude? Glad to be back. Excited for this special episode. Give the people the truth about what's going on with this CO2 stuff, where it's coming from, why it's coming, what we're going to do about it, and then what kind of impact we're actually going to have as we start to reduce the emissions in this industry.
Yes, sir. Yeah, we're going to be legit on this one. Hashtag no fake news found here in the podcast. Straight facts. Straight facts. What do you think about that, Joe Bo?
I'm excited about it. Glad to be back. I missed y'all boys.
Yeah, for sure. We've been all over. And we also will continue the regular scheduled episodes with guests on in that final segment. We're going to have a guest next week. So the regular style of episodes will return as well. But for now, it's going to be us three talking about stuff that matters to the concrete industry most. So we got a lot of things to tackle. One thing that we'll continue to tackle throughout the entire episode is misinformation, or not necessarily misinformation, but possibly a false perceptive.
Yeah, maybe you're only getting one side of the story here. Maybe there's more to drill down that you're just not aware of, and we weren't aware of until we drilled down into it.
Right. Well, and by that I mean, the concrete industry gets slammed for carbon emissions. It's low-hanging fruit, but it's not necessarily warranted. And like always, we talk about it here on the show, there's a big difference between concrete and cement. And a lot of people don't get that right, even academics. And I think one thing to cover is the term sink. And what is a sink as we talk about it today?
Yeah, so we're not gonna decouple cement emissions from concrete emissions because no one who's analyzing this is decoupling it. So we're just going to have to roll with what they're using as their terminology, and we're going to do that. Part of what you don't see in the headlines a lot is a full life cycle analysis of these things. And so as we get to talking, you may hear us talk about a sink, and that is a product's ability to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. The CO2 is sunk into the product. So if you hear that terminology, it was new for us. So as we talk about it, we didn't want people to be left out there.
Yeah, I think a recurring topic that we're going to see in this podcast is going to be just education to the general public. I know I kind of liken some of these things to
my experience in the hunting community, but it's literally the only other thing I know about other than concrete. That's the two parts of my life is hunting and concrete. But we see similar things, in the hunting industry. And I'll give you a really recent example. I just came across this morning. So in Washington State, they have a bear hunting season in the springtime. And to make a long story short, the general public basically voted to eliminate that spring bear season, even though the Wildlife Commission of that state basically said that the hunting of these bears in the springtime does not affect the population. So the population is still maintaining or growing, even with this hunting season. But the general public decided that they wanted to do away with it despite any scientific-based management practices in that state. And we see that happen all the time in the hunting industry with things with similar issues with bears or trapping or whatever. And so the reason I bring that up is it sounds pretty similar to what we're going to talk about today, in that a lot of people don't really have as good of a grasp on things as we do or others in the industry. It's just a common thing for us here in the industry to discuss what we're going to be discussing today.
I'll throw that back on ourselves too. That as we were researching this topic in depth, because we knew we wanted to talk about it, you read all these scary stories about how many emissions are out there and how much it's done. And I tell you, if that's all you read all day, I can understand why you're a little bit scared of these greenhouse gas emissions. I get it. And to come on here today, we're going to do an in-depth dive for our industry specifically and say what the real picture is and where we think it's headed. We're not looking to get labeled climate deniers or anything like that. We're just trying to be pragmatists and say, although there is some CO2 emissions, what is it really for us, and what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, there's certainly a disadvantage to the social media is the best worst thing to happen to us in the last couple decades, in that a lot of people may be getting one side of a viewpoint from an industry. Like hunting, for example, you see all the time. There's a big media story about some guy going to Africa and trophy hunting and blah, 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 blah. Well, the same can be said with construction. And in some circles, construction and the byproducts of construction and the material manufacturing process and everything that has to do with that, they only see the negative side. And while we're on our side of the industry, we could probably do a better job of presenting these facts, and I think that's what we're trying to do today, and just represent the construction industry in a positive manner and just educate people on what really goes on, because the people that aren't involved in construction is a vast majority of the population. The construction is still a pretty niche community, but all of the other people that are going to be casting their vote in favor of or against some bills or certain politicians that want to push things through, their opinion matters, and it needs to be an educated opinion, because at the end of the day, the majority rules, and if they don't have an accurate viewpoint of what really goes on in the industry, then it's gonna hurt us, no doubt. We'll kind of start things off here, with CO2 emissions. The stat you often see is that cement is 8% of global CO2 emissions, but in the U.S. it's only 3%. And interestingly enough, the push for green cement is coming from foreign-based multinationals, and it directly affects the production here in the United States. So again, we get labeled as having all these CO2 emissions, and that this push for green cement is coming from overseas. It's not even coming from here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was in a presentation from a guy who's from NRMCA. This was last week, and he's given this big presentation about how we're all going to go green, and we're going to self-regulate ourselves as an industry. Cement, ready mix together. We're going to self-regulate. We're going to reduce our carbon emissions. And so he starts giving this big presentation from the Concrete Sustainability Council. It starts going over all the different tiers you can achieve as a producer to say, yes, I am in the gold or the platinum because I reduce more emissions than my peers. And at the end of the presentation, one of the producers in the room spoke up and said, well, what do those little tiers get us? He says, oh, well, you could put that on your product, advertise that you've reached the gold and platinum tier or whatever. And he says, I don't get lead credit. I don't get any recognition. It's just for advertising. He says, well, yeah. You now have a better product because it's lower emission. And he said, well, you're talking about spending millions of dollars to be able to get this little placard that nobody even recognizes. And it's not going to benefit my business in the short term at all. It's going to be on the concrete producer or the cement producer to upsell the value of this. And it's something that they can't limit to like one product. Because if you go through this change, it affects every product they make. And so, it was an interesting disconnect between the presenter and the people he's presenting to. And that was sort of the basis for why we're coming together and we want to get all these things out on the table. And the presenter said something interesting, kind of what Joey just said. It's coming from foreign-based multinationals. And his comment to the whole room was, well, Europe's already doing it. And they're 6 years ahead of us. And the whole room just like let out this big sigh, like, oh, brother, really? We're focused on Europe. So why is it that way? Why are we that way in the U.S.? Why do we want to, sort of guffaw at what they're doing over there? And as you start digging into the numbers, there might be a case. So the emissions for the cement and concrete industry is only 3% in this country. And then you learn the word sink. And we find out that if you actually do the whole life cycle assessment, the life cycle analysis, you don't just say, hey, cement emits 8%, and then you find out that concrete actually sinks 60% of that back into itself. So in the United States, you're talking about 1.4% of CO2 emissions comes from the cement and concrete industry.
Right. And what you said by sink is the concrete literally absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere naturally.
Correct. Right. And so it's a sponge, soaks it up, that CO2 gets in, the calcium ions that are in there, they're probably in the form of calcium oxide. They're going to react with the CO2. Now it is bound calcium carbonate back inside the concrete. So like through the years, we always heard like, hey, concrete gets stronger and stronger with age. The longer it's in the ground, it actually continues gaining strength. Well, why is that? Well, this is part of that reason. But it also has a great benefit of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So we have to look at this as a full life cycle analysis. And when you put that in perspective of the United States, we're talking about 1.4% of CO2 emissions is directly related to our industry. And then it's like, okay, so we do have some emissions. 1.4% of the whole country is directly related to us. So what can we do to offset that? And people are looking at blended cements, whether it's the 1L cements or the LC3 cements. There's other technologies coming down the road. But one of the things that nobody's talking about is that the biggest thing we can do is replace asphalt paving with concrete paving. Because now asphalt, which it gets kind of buried into some other stuff, but we ran the numbers. So if you go and just trying to find like how much CO2 is emitted by asphalt paving, you can't find it. There's no number. It's buried down in like transportation and oil. It's just like sort of sunk in there and kind of divided up. You actually have to go do the numbers. We did the numbers. It would be by itself, as a category, by itself, 8.7% of all CO2 emissions in this country would be asphalt. And that's in the United States alone.
Right.
So if concrete and cement is 1.4 and asphalt is 8.7, just making that switch right there, you've got at least a 5% positive.
Right.
At least.
Well, this is where I talk about perception, like how you view things. Things can be viewed a number of different ways, but as it pertains to civil construction, especially construction that is state funded, their perception is by election cycle most of the time. Infrastructure bills are presented by administrations that are on election cycles. no one is looking at this as a total life cycle, because the total life cycle of concrete is always going to be longer than that of asphalt, but it's more expensive. Not in the long term, but in the short term, it definitely is. And if you're looking at things in a 4-year period or a 2-year period in some cases, then our argument or the stats that you just presented kind of gets lost in the weeds because, quite frankly, it doesn't matter to some people.
Yeah, I just don't think we're looking macro enough.
No,
but
I agreed.
But nobody is talking about what we just talked about right there.
Correct.
You're not hearing that anywhere from any place. We're finding out here, right here on the Ad 10 podcast. It's first place. So that instead of trying to drill down and spend millions of dollars to try and reduce the emissions of our industry, which in this country only contributes to 1.4%, instead of trying to spend millions to make that 1%, why don't we take a step back and say, are there other industries that are polluting that we can replace? And the answer is asphalt. But nobody's marketing concrete in that way to say, hey, we can reduce 5% of all greenhouse emissions in this country if we make that one switch.
Yeah, and perhaps it will help if we market ourselves a different way. And as much as I don't like this, it is what it is. Buzzwords, buzz terms help, right? So with in mind all the stats that we just threw out, and you're down to 1.5% and possibly even lower with a little bit of effort, all of a sudden you can start throwing out the term carbon neutral. When you say carbon neutral, people's ears perk up. No matter how legitimate it actually is, you start saying carbon neutral, and all of a sudden some politician somewhere that likes to put 3 words on a sign to get people's attention, now they got people's attention.
Yeah, asphalt is nowhere near the carbon sink that concrete is, and I think we need to clarify. We're speaking sink, or spelling sink S-I-N-K, like literally, draining and funneling down and collecting it. Asphalt is so dense, it's tar, it's rock. There's not really much, for absorption of almost anything in there. Whereas concrete is almost literally a sponge. It's filled with voids, micro air bubbles, and it can really absorb that carbon. And when you're thinking about the life cycle, it's not just that a unit of concrete is lasting longer than a unit of asphalt. You got to consider in repair on the asphalt, having to come in, tear it up, redo it. All kinds of maintenance that involves asphalt, that involves heavy machinery that you won't find with concrete. You lay concrete down and there's minimal repair to it throughout its life cycle. You may have to, patch a place or two, or, there's some kind of minimal thing going on there, but you just don't have the maintenance with concrete that you do with asphalt.
Yeah, 100%. And getting back to what Josh was saying, he was talking about we're going to try and go carbon neutral. The powers that be have spoken. The industry's moving that way. These multinationals have come in, they've partnered with the PCA here and said, this is what we're doing. We're going to be carbon neutral. So how do we get there? Yeah, we only need 1.4% if we're, here in the U.S. If we're going to go by the stats, let's not blow things out of proportion and act like this industry's on fire. We need to think of ourselves in a higher light. We're getting killed globally with this 8% number. But here in the U.S., we need to be thinking 1.4% is the number. So we perhaps can get to carbon neutral. So one of the technologies that actually looks pretty promising, I'm excited about, is the carbon capture technology. And so there is a federal grant that's being given out right now. It's $4 million, this grant. And it's going to actually go to the University of Illinois, and they're going to do this study at the St. Mary's plant up there in Illinois, and they're going to try and take the carbon right out as soon as it's being emitted up the smokestack of the cement plant. They're going to take it out right there. They're actually going to use a very specific company's technology, and it's called pressure swing adsorption. So this is a technique we'd never heard of until we started researching this, but apparently it's pretty common. They use it for all types of gases, hydrogen, a few other things, and it's used to separate the gas species. And when you have a mixture of gases, and you can take out the one you want, as long as you know their specific gravity of the molecule you're going for. And so what this company's doing is they're actually changing that pressure to sort the molecules, and then they're introducing cryogenic freeze like right after that, which solidifies it into like a liquid state, so you can actually transport it. In this case, they're not looking to transport it out of the smokestack so they can like reuse it. They're actually looking just to pump it right back down into the ground. You put it in the ground with water, and it goes down into whatever the layer of rock is. One of the examples I showed is a basalt rock that was very, very porous. And when you put the CO2 directly down in there with water, it actually crystallizes when it gets down in there and just makes the rock formation down there very, very solid. And so if that is true, if this type of technology will allow us to capture carbon out of the cement plant during the production, I really think that alone could get us to carbon neutral.
This particular cement plant retrofit that they're talking about, they claim the method can separate up to 95%.
Yeah, that's right.
Of the carbon dioxide. Otherwise, that would be released into the environment, but in this place, it's going down to a basalt rock that's probably, 80 to 100 feet underground.
Yeah, however far the well is. Yeah, I'm sure you could do different depths and different wells, but yeah, that's about right. But it doesn't matter like how pie in the sky we want to be about being green or carbon neutral, or hey, even on the good side, carbon negative. It all comes with a cost. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when that guy was giving that presentation from the NRMCA on behalf of the Concrete Sustainability Council, you could see every producer in the room just looking at dollar signs on the screen. And it's tough when you're in our business. We're in a commodity business. Whether we like to admit that to ourselves or not, concrete is a commodity. Cement is a commodity ingredient going into our commodity product. Mm-hmm. And you start adding all these costs on the back or the front end of this, you got to make it up on the back end.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, you're 100% right. I mean, it's a high volume, low margin business. It always has been. And if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. And you also have to look at things in relativity as well. I mean, the study that we're talking about here for this carbon capture research, $4 million is a big number, but it's also not a big number. You look at the amount of money that they're spending on other energy resources or other renewable energy methods that are much, much less efficient and also not adopted yet. You would have to change everything about the energy structure of our country or the world in order to adopt certain technology. When you start looking at wind, solar, and everyone knows that everyone that listens to this show knows that I'm a huge proponent of nuclear energy as far as the efficiency of it. But you look at the massive sums of money that you need to sink into a nuclear energy facility. All of a sudden, $4 million doesn't seem that much, relatively speaking. So,
yeah, $4 million seems really cheap to me because we've all been on job sites and we've been around enough that we've seen things that cost about $4 million. It doesn't seem that much when you think about it.
What? That's the amount of the grant.
Yeah.
From the feds.
Right.
That they're giving, and that doesn't include the private money that's coming in from the St. Mary's folks as they sort of help out. And then if it all works, then you could talk about designing one of these fancy systems that take the CO2 out. And then you got to do that to all the plants. I mean, I just can't even imagine what that number would be to retrofit one of these plants. Because for the folks who haven't seen it, and we'll link to it in the show notes of this, but when you go look at like what one of these gas pressure swing adsorption deals with the cryogenic attached to the end of it, I mean, it's massive. It's huge. It's going to take people a lot smarter than the folks here to operate it, and that's going to cost money. It all costs money, and the cement industry is going to want a premium for that. I mean, I know I would. It's not all going to be for the good stewardship of the planet. These people are running businesses, and as much as the guys on this podcast right here, we want to leave every place we go into, we want to leave better than we found it, because that's how we were raised, and that's no different to how we approach the earth. But we're also businessmen, and so at times, I think sometimes we can take, or I'll speak for myself here, take a side eye when I see people come out that are head of these massive corporations and are like, hey, everything's green because we want to be the best stewards of the environment. And I only think that's half the story.
You can speak for me there as well.
I think the other half is that it's a business move. And one of the things as a business that if you are sort of gauging the political winds of how things are moving, whether in your specific country or region or globally, you got to think proactively. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is that in order to make an industry change, you can either offer them a carrot or a stick. There's two ways to get people moving. And in this industry, it is my opinion that these big multinationals are trying to offer themselves a carrot so that the government, politicians, NGOs that are going to craft policies are not going to hit them with a stick.
Yeah.
So can we as an industry get out in front of it and then market it successfully and say, hey, we're actually carbon neutral. Please don't hit us with insane regulations that make it almost impossible to run our businesses.
Well, yeah, perfect example about perception. And I kind of touched on the political aspect of that a little bit earlier. You go out as an industry and prove that you can achieve carbon neutrality or close to it, then all of a sudden when these politicians want to talk about the carbon emissions, be like, no, listen here. In your infrastructure proposals, you should be proposing more concrete paving. You should be, talking about how concrete can actually lower emissions. You want to pave these roads with asphalt every 2 years or every 4 years. You're doing repaves on major highways. Maybe you can talk about in this infrastructure plan, talk about how, we're going to spend a little bit more money up front in the, how can you word this as a politician? I'm terrible at this, but.
That's why we're not politicians.
Yeah, right. And in the pursuit of carbon neutrality, we're going to spend a little bit more money up front, but we're going to pave things with concrete because they have less maintenance long term, they last longer, they absorb carbon out of the air, so on and so on and so on. Talk about all the great bullet points. Now, all of a sudden, if you change the perception of these politicians, they're less likely to hit you with a stick.
Yeah, and the NRMCA has been trying to market concrete paving just on a cost-for-cost basis, saying, hey, we're really close now. Mm-hmm. Concrete paving is very close to the price of asphalt paving. But one thing we don't see in the marketing is relative to greenhouse gas emissions. Right. The asphalt industry, for whatever reason, whether it was just dumb luck or strategic, they're not really getting hit, I don't feel like, with the same kind of emissions. They're not getting hit over the head the way the cement and concrete industry is. But that's because there's no figures tied directly to them. You have to literally go in and find how much asphalt was produced, and then find white papers that explain the life cycle of that and what those emissions look like, and then do those calculations yourself, because it's all buried into other stuff. And so we had to pull that out ourselves. And so I think going forward, like you said, Josh, we have to market better that concrete's actually the greener alternative to pavement. And oh, by the way, it's actually not going to cost you much more at all.
Right.
Yeah, it all comes back to education. Like we've said before, the general public needs to know this, and we're doing that today. I don't know if it needs to be pushed on social media or just whatever.
I think it's important to bring up the other construction materials that we get compared to a lot. So we don't get compared to the emissions on asphalt very much, even though it is a very direct competitor to us in the paving world. But we do get compared quite often to steel and wood. And if you look at their marketing, steel's trying to do what concrete's trying to do, which is just ignore emissions. Just like, we're not the best, but, we're very vital to the world. So I think we can reshape the narrative on concrete. Already we've discussed that. Now we can discuss what we're compared to. And so the asphalt is going to be over 8% of emissions. Iron and steel is about 7.2% of global emissions, and deforestation of the wood is only 2.2%. So that doesn't, the deforestation, we're talking about life cycle analysis there. So the trees are really good, obviously, taking in CO2 and then turning that into oxygen. So the guys, that's when it's alive. But wood is going to use that as part of their life cycle analysis. Hey, while we're waiting to cut it down, it's soaking up CO2. One thing with the concrete that we don't talk about a lot is crushed concrete. When you rip it back up, you crush it, and it's just sitting in a yard somewhere, just waiting to either be used or landfilled. Guess what that's doing the whole time? It's laying there. It's a carbon sink. And it's actually better now that it's broken up because you've exposed more surface area.
Right.
So you've got more sink going on. So it's not a bad thing if you got some of that broken concrete just laying around your plant, getting ready to use it as a RCA. In the meantime, it's soaking up a whole lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And as we start to compare ourselves to these other materials and we start to continue to build and we want to build more green, there's other forces at play that are driving this outside of the concrete cement industry, outside of the regulatory agencies. We're also dealing with academia that is constantly researching ways to reduce these emissions and spitting out these statistics like 8%. We're responsible, our industry is responsible for 8% of emissions. I was just on a call today with some very, very smart guys who are doing research at a university, and they're looking at reducing the CO2 of concrete. They're using some of our products in their research. And, I challenged them. I said, wait a minute, you're using these big numbers, but you didn't take into the life cycle analysis of this. You're not taking into account that the USA is actually way better than the statistics you're throwing out. How come you're not talking about any of that? If you're marketing this to the USA, why aren't you doing that? And, they just said, oh, I'm not familiar with all those things you said, so I can't speak to it. And they just went on to the next thing. And I think that kind of fired me up even more coming in here because these people are right in the middle of it. They're leading the charge, the tip of the spear. And they don't even seem to have all the numbers that we're presenting here in this podcast.
You think that's because they don't need to?
Well, what's their job? Their job is to get grants.
Yeah.
And test stuff and then eventually get it to market so they can get more grants and more partners and get more things to market. And if this is the way you're going to get grants by saying these things, then that's what you're going to say. And it doesn't mean they're wrong. Their data's not wrong, but I think it could have been more precise. But if you don't need to dig down and learn the precision necessary for this country, and you're not saying – so instead of flouting and touting 8%, instead you could be saying 1.4%, which is a much more positive number. Well, that's not going to get you a grant. You're going to go after stuff that they think are low-hanging fruits. And,
right.
That's what we're doing. But academia is typically 10 to 20 years ahead of stuff that's actually in the field. So instead of trying to revamp this, are there other grants that could be, put out there? Or there's other technology that we're doing? And the reason for that would be not focused on CO2 reduction in our industry because we're only 1.4%. We're not 8%. So the United States government, why aren't we putting money in other places to advance other technologies that could really make things better for the people rather than looking at carbon emissions, which, as we've learned here today, is much less of a problem for our industry than we thought.
Well put. Quick joke, real if you could. You were talking about studies and grants and presenting things the way they need to be presented. Whenever I see a study, and for anything, not carbon based, but with anything, I put my Dale Gribble hat on, and I immediately look at who funded the study, and then I formulate my opinion on what the study actually says. And I urge everybody else to do the exact same.
Well, it's almost like one of those situations where the money's not in the cure. The money is in the research. The money is in the treatment. We've heard that about several things, throughout our life.
Yeah. Well, for academia especially, it's, that's their lifeblood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but for the takeaway of this podcast, we come in here, I was a little angry because I just talked to these academics like 5 minutes before I walked in here. About this exact subject matter. But I think this is supposed to be a positive referendum on our industry. This podcast has hopefully brought some knowledge to say that in this country, in this industry, we're doing a great job.
Yeah, for what we can control, we're doing very well at it.
We're doing a great job, and we need to continue doing a great job. And as we start touting ourselves in this industry, in this country, we need to make people aware what the accurate numbers are. And as we go down the path of reducing carbon emissions, we need to realize we're going to be carbon neutral very, very quickly. And hopefully that comes in a manner that isn't costly, so that we're not going to raise the cost of building homes, not going to raise the cost of building publicly funded roads. We're going to come at this thing responsibly from a cost standpoint and responsibly from an environmental standpoint. And I think we're a lot closer than anyone would have you believe.
Yeah, well said. I can't beat that. Way to put a bow on things, Paul Finley. You said earlier when we were joking around that you're not very good at putting things in political speak, but if you had a podium in front of you with a flag in the background, I'd vote for you.
I need the West Wing music in the background.
Yeah. Maybe I can make that happen and post edit.
There you go. There's your clip. Yeah, with the flag waving in the background and West Wing music.
Well, with that being said, and so eloquently put, we'll put a bow on this thing. I think the few messages that we wanted to get across with our roundtable here is that, the cement industry and the concrete industry in general, it's not as doom and gloom as it seems sometimes. And if you change your perception and really dig down, think objectively and look at the stats and try to understand what's actually happening long term with a very macro point of view, our industry is doing well, as you stated. We're doing well with being aware of what our footprint actually is. We're being proactive in trying to minimize that as much as possible, and we can do so in a way where it's productive and beneficial to all parties involved. Whether it's the people trying to sell the concrete, the people trying to make the concrete and keep the lights on at the plants, and even people who are trying to legislate things. Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of money to be had with state DOT projects outside of civil construction.
Dude, I'm telling you, NRMCA's new push, save the planet, pave with concrete.
There you go. Yeah, put it on a t-shirt.
Amen.
I like it. Well, with all that being said, we really hope that this podcast reaches as many ears as possible and we can make a true difference with our roundtable here. And should we come across other key pressing issues, we could have more of these. And we look forward to having more of these conversations and bringing light, facts, and statistics to things that we're faced with every single day. So we'll look to do more of these in the future. But also, speaking of the future, you can look for more podcast content. We're going to have at least 3 more episodes before the end of the year with different guests on from various sides of the industry. And we'll press them on, what's bothering them? What are their pains in the industry? What are they looking for? And kind of see how their perspective is, because if there's one buzz term or buzzword we can take away from this episode, it's all about perspective. So we'll come at you guys with some guests here before the end of the year with plenty of content to keep you interested and busy. And until the next one, y'all be good.